Nice to meet you, Mr. Siemens.
A pleasure, thank you. Good to be here.
So my first question is on the opposition between XMOOCs and CMOOCs. Should we always oppose them, and could we eventually mix both approaches to design new kind of hybrid MOOCs?
Sure, well, you know, probably one way to look at it, or at least the way that I look at it, is that XMOOCs and CMOOCs address different knowledge needs. And so an XMOOC, as an example, looks at what is known in a discipline already, and then helping others get sort of a foundational knowledge in that area. Whereas a CMOOC is more interested in generative approaches to knowledge, you know, creativity, developing, learning new things, or new things for a discipline, as an example. So I think in that regard, if we look at them not as in competition, but as serving two entirely different knowledge needs, then I wouldn't look at them as necessarily being in conflict. Creating a hybrid model of the two, I think it'd be interesting. I think there's some level at which, even in our learning experience, we're always moving from acquiring knowledge, like what does someone else know or what's known in a field, to trying to generate something, to acquiring, and so on. So I would say if you're looking at a bachelor's degree, and there's two approaches, so I'm going to first provide sort of one view, and then I'll just give us, just at the end, just to invalidate that, give a secondary view. But so when we start as students in university at a bachelor's level, there are many things that we have to learn. You know, we have to learn how to name biological entities. We have to learn basic theorems in math. We have to learn basic ideas in physics. So I think in that regard, we're always acquiring or duplicating knowledge of others when we first start in an entirely new knowledge space. So it's possible that if you have a learning design model that begins by providing what is known in this field, and then adds, once a bit of a foundation is laid, then adds in the next level of what can you create based on what you know, then there's a possibility to blend those two. So that's the one view. Now, as a slightly contradictory view, the work of Carl Bereider, who's written extensively on knowledge in sort of today's society and knowledge economy, he would argue that even at a very, very young level, even students in the primary and secondary school system should be knowledge generators, not knowledge duplicators. And even if we're learning something that is already known by others in the field, pedagogically, the way we should acquire it is not through instructivist means, but more through active and engaged learning. So that's just a bit of a secondary point to my answer.
Okay, thank you very much. The second question is, MOOC is kind of a bottom-up approach of learning. How do we integrate this kind of courses in a top-down culture like French culture?
Yeah. Well, that's I think a challenge, and it's certainly not just French culture. I think almost globally the school system has been designed to be top-down, and that I think reflects various attributes of government and just the organization of society as a whole. I don't know what it'll be like in the future, but there are a few examples of this already in knowledge generation in society today. So a few illustrations would be what's happened with the social movement societally, how people organize without organizations. And they do this essentially through social media and through being connected to one another. And if you consider the organizational structure, even of a company that's very hierarchical, that has a very traditional management layer down to employees, even in those organizations, if you do an analysis of the social network of that organization, you'll find that knowledge in that company doesn't flow the way that the the organizational chart flows. Instead, people are connected across different spaces, and you could have one person that could be critical to the flow of knowledge in, let's say, one department. And she might not even be the leader of that department, she's just someone who's very well connected. So I think in that regard, it's worth realizing that even now, even though if French culture is very structured and hierarchical, the flow of information and ideas is likely more networked. And I think that's a transitory period in society where in the past, when geography was important and when we had certain structures to government, and much like if you read, let's say, the development of the Roman structure of organizing society, which influences many developed economies today, that was you needed that hierarchical model in order to be able to manage remote regions of your empire. Well, today we have different capacities to communicate. You don't need that kind of staged or structured model remotely where you have the hub at the center. Instead, you get a very flattened society and a flattened organization. But we're still experimenting. We haven't figured out what does this look like. How do we make this a part of our entire functioning as a society? And that'll take us time to absorb, to the sense where we recognize, even now, if you want an illustration is the Obama presidency, they've experimented with social media and network technologies to connect with the electorate, first of all for being elected. They've also made attempts to try and allow citizens' voices through petitions online to gain some traction. So those have been attempts, but they're very young attempts, and there's a lot of negative in some case that's come out of it, but I think it's an indication of a way of thinking about governance that gives greater credit to the voices at the what's currently viewed as being the lower tier of the societal model. How does that relate to MOOCs? I think it's the way that we transition in information flow in society as a whole, how we communicate with one another, eventually is reflected in the way we teach and in the way we learn. And so the hierarchical structured society will become more amenable to CMOOCs, if you will, as those technologies make a bigger impact in society.
Okay, thank you very much. And my last one is on the future of education and what place will the MOOC take in the education of the next century?
Well, you know, MOOCs in my eyes are a trend that's sort of at its current stage. And what I mean with that is that right now we're using the word MOOC to describe a lot of trends. So MOOCs, I think, are less an idea and more a lens to view a whole sequence of changes. And these changes there are many different components to it. On the one hand, we're seeing more of a knowledge need in society. More jobs are knowledge-based. We're seeing the development of greater quantities of technology in all aspects of our lives. We're seeing the growth of analytics with data as a way of interacting with information with one another, openness in education, some of the economic change pressures. So there's a huge range of trends happening. And MOOCs are a reflection of those trends, but also a lens through which we can view those trends. So from that end, the general idea of a MOOC, not the name, so if we can separate the name MOOC from the idea that MOOCs reflect, the name is going to probably have a shorter shelf life. It's something that now gains attention because people can understand what a MOOC is. Politicians, journalists, people in society in many parts of the world, they've heard of MOOCs. Now, less have heard about advanced pedagogical techniques, or less of, so there's this distinction that it's a buzzword that captures people's attention, and that's a good thing, I think, because there are more people talking about education now than at any point that I can recall in recent memory. So from that end, MOOCs are very important because they're going to, they're going to raise the profile of discussion around education in our society today. The more important trends that MOOCs reflect, those are going to have a longer trajectory. And what I mean with that is that even if the buzzword of MOOCs in 5 years' time is replaced with a new word, then those words will still demonstrate the progression of these factors societally that are driving forward with a new education model. What I think in the future, though, is that the university itself will undergo some fairly dramatic changes. It will, my argument at least, is that the university is a reflective entity, or will become reflective of the complexification of society as a whole. And so that means universities, if university leaders have a vision and are able to properly execute that vision, universities in the future will be much better integrated in society. It won't be a place that we'll go to for 4 years or 6 years when we're younger and then get into the workforce. Instead, it will be a place that will be integrated with all aspects of what we do. For lifelong learning, life-wide learning, it will be a part of our society the way that many other institutions are right now, integrated within our society, you know, social or cultural institutions.